The laughter had not stopped for 11 minutes, and I was counting. I stood in the receiving hall of the Threndari Ascendancy, holding a folder that contained the single most important document my species had ever written, and I watched a room full of ancient, glittering beings treat it like a joke told by a child. My name is Elena Whitfield. I was 31 years old, and I had trained for 6 years to be standing in that hall. Nothing in those 6 years had prepared me for the sound of an empire laughing at us. The hall itself was built to make you feel small. The ceiling rose so high that clouds actually formed near the top, drifting lazily under lights that mimicked 3 different suns. The walls were carved from a black stone that seemed to swallow sound, except for laughter, which somehow it let through perfectly. Rows of nobles sat on curved platforms that hovered a few feet off the ground, their robes catching light in ways no human fabric could. And at the center of it all, on a throne shaped like an open hand, sat Lord Vesserin Thal, the presiding voice of the Ascendancy Court. He was the one holding our invitation. He read it aloud again, for the 3rd time, in our own language, mimicking the careful, formal tone our diplomats had used. We, the peoples of Earth, extend this invitation to the Threndari Ascendancy, in the hope of building a lasting friendship between our civilizations. He paused. The hall went quiet, waiting for it. A lasting friendship, he repeated. And the laughter came again, louder this time, rolling through the hall like a wave. I kept my face still. I had been trained for this too, though no one had told me it would feel like standing in a fire and being told not to flinch. Beside me stood Owen Pratt, our lead negotiator, a calm man with silver at his temples who had spent his whole career trying to keep humanity's voice steady in rooms that did not want to hear it. He did not laugh. He did not frown. He simply waited, the way you wait out a storm you cannot stop, because you know the sky always runs out of rain eventually. Your species, Lord Vesserin said, once the laughter had softened into scattered chuckles, has existed as a spacefaring people for what? 40 years? 50? 43 years, my lord, Owen answered, his voice even. 43 years. Vesserin let the number sit in the air like something rotting. We were already old when your ancestors were still deciding whether fire was a good idea, and you send us an invitation, as though we were neighbors deciding whether to share a meal. A counselor near the front, a tall being with skin like polished bronze and eyes that never seemed to blink, rose slightly from her platform. Perhaps they misunderstand the word invitation, she said, and her voice carried an edge sharper than the laughter had been. Perhaps in their language it means something closer to a request for charity. More laughter. I felt my jaw tighten, and I made myself relax it, because I remembered what Owen had told me on the shuttle ride down. They will try to make us angry. Anger is what they expect from something young. Do not give them what they expect. I did not give them what they expected. I stood there and I watched, and somewhere behind my calm face, I started paying very close attention to something none of them seemed to notice. They were laughing at us, yes, but they were also afraid of something, though they did not know it yet, and I would not understand what that something was for a long time. What I noticed, standing there, was smaller than that. It was the way certain nobles glanced toward a specific archway at the back of the hall whenever Vesserin spoke, as though checking to see if someone unseen approved of the mockery. It was the way the ancient star charts carved into the hall's black walls, charts that had not changed in thousands of years, seemed to hum faintly, almost imperceptibly, if you stood close enough and listened. I did not know yet that those charts were about to become the least reliable maps in the galaxy. Lord Vesserin stood from his throne, and the whole hall fell into a deeper silence, the kind that arrives out of respect rather than fear, though I suspected fear was somewhere underneath it too. He walked down from the platform, robes trailing behind him like liquid shadow, and stopped a few paces from Owen and me. "Let me tell you what an invitation means to us," he said, his voice quieter now, which somehow made it worse. "It means recognition. It means we consider you an equal, or at least someone worth becoming an equal. Your species has not earned that word. You arrived in our space by accident, following technology you did not build, using ships you barely understand, and you believe that gives you the right to sit across from civilizations that have shaped galaxies." He leaned closer, and for a moment I thought I saw something behind his ancient eyes that was not amusement at all. It looked almost like curiosity, the way a person looks at an insect that has, against all odds, learn to open a door. Go home, he said. Grow up. Build something worth showing us. Perhaps in 1,000 years, when your species has learned patience, we will speak again. He turned his back on us. In Threndari custom, I would learn later, turning your back on someone in a formal hall was the most complete dismissal available, more final than any spoken refusal. The court began to murmur and disperse, nobles floating away on their platforms, already discussing other matters, already forgetting us, the way you forget a joke once you have laughed at it enough times. Owen did not move for a long moment, neither did I. Around us, the hall emptied, the black walls swallowing the last echoes of laughter, and I finally let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. We had traveled across a hostile, unfamiliar stretch of space, carrying the hopes of an entire planet, and we had been treated like children who did not understand the meaning of their own words. "Elena," Owen said quietly, once we were mostly alone, "how are you doing?" "I'm angry," I admitted. "Good," he said, which surprised me. "Hold on to it. Just don't let them see it." We walked out of that hall together, past guards who did not bother to look at us, past nobles who had already moved on to conversations about matters they considered important. I remember glancing back once, at the great black doors closing behind us, and thinking that this was probably the last time I would ever see the inside of that place. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything that mattered. The shuttle ride back to our transport was silent, except for the low hum of engines and the occasional soft beep of instruments confirming our course. I sat by the window, watching the Ascendancy's home system slide past, dozens of planets connected by threads of light that served as their transit lanes, ancient megastructures orbiting their star, like jewelry too large for any hand. It was beautiful, and humiliating at the same time, the way it is humiliating to admire something that has just told you that you do not belong near it. "They're not wrong, you know," I said eventually, more to the window than to Owen. "About the technology. We didn't build it. We were given it." "That's true," Owen said, "but they're wrong about what that means." I turned to look at him. He was watching the same view I was, but there was something different in his expression, something I could not quite place at the time. It was not anger, and it was not disappointment. It looked almost like patience, the kind you carry when you already know how a story ends, and you are simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "What do you mean?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way he always did, carefully, like a man setting down something fragile. "They think being given technology means you are dependent on it," he said. "They think it means you will always need someone to hand you the next piece, and the next, forever behind, forever grateful for scraps." He glanced at me. "They have not considered what happens when a species is given a key, and instead of just using it to open the door they were shown, decides to learn how locks work." I did not fully understand what he meant, not then. I thought he was simply trying to comfort me, the way people say hopeful things after a hard day, without any real weight behind them. It would be months before I understood that Owen Pratt had known things that day that I did not, and that his calm was not comfort at all. It was certainty. The transport ship carried us back toward the edge of Ascendancy space, through checkpoints manned by board officials who barely glanced at our credentials, through corridors of stars that had watched empires rise and fall the way seasons change. I spent most of that journey replaying the hall in my mind, the laughter, the dismissal, the casual cruelty of being told to grow up by beings who could not imagine what growing up might look like for a species like ours. I did not sleep well on that trip. I kept thinking about small details that did not seem to matter at the time, the way one particular archway had drawn glances all evening, the strange, faint hum I thought I had imagined coming from ancient star charts carved into stone, the way Owen had looked at those same charts, just for a moment, with an expression that was not curiosity at all, but something closer to recognition, as though he were looking at a machine he already understood better than the people who had built the room around it. I did not ask him about it. I wish now that I had, if only because I would have liked to know sooner what was coming. We reached the edge of Ascendancy territory 2 days later, passing through the last checkpoint into the quiet stretch of space that separated their empire from the rest of the galaxy. I remember standing at the observation deck, watching the checkpoint's lights shrink behind us, feeling something strange settle over me. It was not relief, though I had expected relief. It was something closer to the feeling you get standing at the top of a hill, just before you start walking down the other side, when you can see the whole valley spread out below you, and you understand, all at once, how far you still have to go. I did not know, standing there, that the valley below me was about to change shape entirely. I did not know that somewhere back home, in facilities most of humanity had never heard of, people had been working for years on something that would make the word invitation mean something very different the next time we used it. I only knew that I had watched an empire laugh at us, and that Owen Pratt had not laughed back, not because he was too polite, but because he already knew we would not need to. The transport's engines hummed steadily beneath my feet as we turned toward home, and somewhere far behind us, in a hall built from stone that swallowed sound, the ancient star charts of the Threndari Ascendancy continued their faint, patient hum, counting down toward a moment none of them could see coming. None of us could, not really, not yet. But some of us were closer to knowing than others, and I was about to become one of them. The journey back to Earth felt longer than the journey out had been, though the distance was the same. I think it is always that way after a defeat. Time stretches to match the weight of what you are carrying. I spent most of it going over every detail of the hall in my mind, trying to understand what exactly had happened, and why it bothered me so much more than simple embarrassment should. It was not the laughter itself. Laughter fades. It was the certainty behind it, the absolute confidence that nothing we said or did could possibly matter to them, that we were, at best, an amusing footnote in a story they had already finished writing about themselves. That kind of certainty is a strange thing to sit with, because some small, honest part of you wonders if they might be right. I did not know yet how wrong they were. I did not know that the very same week we stood in that hall being laughed at, a team of scientists on Earth had finished the final calculations on a project that had been running in near total silence since before I was even old enough to understand what a star chart was. I only knew that we were going home, quieter than we had left, carrying nothing but a folded piece of paper that no one wanted, and a strange, stubborn feeling that this was not the end of the story. It was not. It was barely the beginning. Home did not feel like home when I landed. It felt like a place I was seeing again for the first time, the way a familiar room looks strange after you have been sick for a long while. I remember stepping off the shuttle at the Geneva transit port and being surprised by how ordinary everything seemed, how unaware everyone around me was of what had happened in that black stone hall a few days earlier. I expected consequences. I expected the story to spread, for the news networks to be full of angry commentary, for politicians to be demanding answers about why our first real attempt at diplomacy with an ancient power had ended in public mockery. I braced myself for blame, for the kind of political storm that follows any failure large enough to matter. None of that happened. There was a brief statement from the Unified Earth Council, calm and carefully worded, saying that talks with the Threndari Ascendancy had not progressed as hoped, and that Earth would continue pursuing peaceful relations with all spacefaring civilizations. It ran for one news cycle and vanished. No outrage, no hearings, no public reckoning. At first I thought this was simply how governments managed embarrassment, burying it under bland language until people forgot to be angry. But the quiet did not feel like management. It felt like patience, the same strange patience I had seen in Owen's face on the transport home, and the longer I sat with it, the more it unsettled me. I was given 2 weeks of leave after the mission, which was standard after any high-level diplomatic assignment. I spent the first few days trying to relax, walking along the lake near my apartment, calling my sister in Manchester, trying to convince myself that the mission had simply failed, and that failure, however humiliating, was something you were allowed to move past. It was during the second week that I noticed the first strange thing. I tried to reach a former colleague of mine, a physicist named Nora Fairweather who had worked with me briefly, years earlier, on early contact linguistics, before moving into what she had always vaguely called deep systems research. We used to have coffee every few months, trade stories about strange alien grammar and stranger alien customs. I sent her a message asking if she wanted to meet. She did not respond for 3 days, which was unusual for her. When she finally did, her reply was short and oddly formal, nothing like her usual warmth. She said she had been reassigned to a new project and would not be reachable for a while, and that she hoped I understood. I did not understand, not then. I simply felt a small, cold prick of unease, the kind you get when something familiar suddenly behaves in an unfamiliar way. It was not just Nora. Over the following days I noticed other small absences. A cousin of mine who worked in orbital engineering stopped posting on the family group chat entirely. A former professor of mine, a materials scientist I still exchanged messages with occasionally, sent a brief note saying he had accepted a position with an organization he could not name, working on a project he could not describe, and that he would be unreachable for an extended period. Each absence on its own meant nothing. People changed jobs, people got busy, but the pattern started to bother me, the way a single loose thread bothers you until you cannot stop pulling at it. I decided to visit Owen. He had always been more connected than I was, more aware of the currents moving beneath the surface of official channels, and if anyone would tell me honestly what was happening, it would be him. I found him at a quiet cafe near the old part of the city, sitting with a cup of tea he had barely touched, looking older than I remembered him looking just 2 weeks earlier. There were faint shadows under his eyes, the kind that come from too many late nights and too much thinking. "Elena," he said, standing to greet me, and there was something careful in the way he said my name, as though he were choosing how much of himself to show me. "I wondered when you would come find me." "Something's happening," I said, sitting across from him without waiting for an invitation. "People are disappearing. Not literally, but close enough. Scientists, engineers, people I used to know, all going quiet at the same time, right after we got laughed out of that hall." Owen studied me for a long moment, the way he used to study a difficult diplomatic phrase before deciding how to translate it. "You always were observant," he said. "It's why they picked you for the mission." "Don't deflect," I said, more sharply than I intended. "Tell me what's going on." He was quiet for a while, turning his cup slowly on its saucer, and I could see him weighing something, deciding how much truth a person could safely be given, and whether I had earned the larger portion of it. "What do you know about the Voss array?" he asked finally. I frowned. The name meant nothing to me. Nothing. I've never heard of it. "Most people haven't," he said. "It started as a research designation, decades ago, back when the first generation of human explorers found scattered ruins in the outer systems, structures that were clearly artificial, clearly ancient, but completely unlike anything the Ascendancy or any other known civilization had ever built. Ruins even they consider dead, inert, not worth studying. And we studied them anyway," I said slowly. "We studied them very quietly," Owen said. "For a long time, we didn't understand what we were looking at. It took decades of work by people most of the public will never know the names of, people like your friend Nora, to even begin to understand the scale of what had been left behind." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Left behind by whom? "Something older than the Ascendancy," Owen said. "Something that came before them, the way the Ascendancy came before us. A civilization the Ascendancy themselves consider ancient history, so far gone that they stopped even studying the ruins centuries ago. They believe whatever built those structures is long extinct, and whatever those structures once did, they believe it stopped working millennia ago." "But it didn't stop working," I said, understanding beginning to dawn on me, cold and enormous. Owen met my eyes, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his expression that was not caution. It was something closer to awe, carefully contained. "It was never dead," he said quietly. "It was sleeping, and we have spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to wake it up." I sat back in my chair, trying to absorb what he was telling me. The cafe around us continued its ordinary evening rhythm, people laughing over drinks, a waiter clearing plates, completely unaware that the man sitting near them had just described something that could reshape everything humanity understood about its place among the stars. "Why tell me now?" I asked. "Why not before the mission, before we walked into that hall and got humiliated for nothing?" "Because the invitation was never about winning their respect that day," Owen said. "It was about giving them the chance to accept us as equals before we had to show them otherwise. We hoped, foolishly perhaps, that they might surprise us, that maybe, just maybe, an old civilization could recognize the beginning of something new, without needing to be forced into it." "They didn't surprise us," I said. "They laughed." "Yes," Owen said. "And now, we no longer need them to understand on their own terms. We simply need them to understand." Before I could ask what that meant, his communicator chimed softly. a discreet tone I recognized as a priority channel, the kind used only for matters that could not wait. He glanced at the message, and something shifted in his face, a kind of readiness replacing the caution that had been there a moment before. "I have to go," he said, standing and leaving payment for his tea on the table. "And Elena, I think it's time you came with me." "Where?" I asked, standing as well, my pulse quickening. "Somewhere most people don't know exists," he said. "A place where the second half of that invitation has been under construction since before you and I ever set foot in that hall." We left the cafe together, walking quickly through streets that seemed suddenly too ordinary for the conversation we had just had. Owen led me to a nondescript vehicle waiting at the curb, its windows darkened, its markings deliberately unremarkable. As we climbed in, I felt the strange sensation of stepping out of the life I had known and into something far larger, something that had been running quietly beneath the surface of the world for longer than I had been an adult. "How long has this been happening?" I asked, as the vehicle pulled away from the cafe and merged smoothly into evening traffic. "Longer than you'd guess," Owen said. "Long enough that some of the people working on it were children when it began. Long enough that we built entire careers, entire institutions, entire cover stories, just to keep it quiet while it grew." "And the invitation," I said, "sending it to the ascendancy, was that ever really about hoping they'd say yes?" Owen was quiet for a moment, watching the city lights slide past the window. "It was a courtesy," he said finally. "A door held open, in case they wanted to walk through it peacefully. We knew, going in, that there was a strong chance they would not. Some of us hoped they would surprise us. Most of us expected exactly what happened. Then why go at all? Why let ourselves be humiliated in front of their whole court? Because history matters," Owen said. "When people ask, someday, whether humanity tried to make peace before it changed everything, we will be able to say yes. We tried. We were polite. We were patient. And we were laughed at for it." He turned to look at me, and there was something steady and unshakable in his eyes. "That matters, Elena. It means what comes next isn't an act of aggression, it's simply the truth, arriving on schedule." I did not fully understand what he meant by that, not yet, but I felt the shape of it settling over me, vast and quiet, like the moment before a held breath finally releases. The vehicle carried us out of the city, past the last scattered lights of the suburbs, into darker country, where the road narrowed, and the stars became suddenly, sharply visible overhead. I found myself looking up at them, without meaning to, searching the sky, as though I might somehow see, written across it, the outline of whatever we were about to become. I did not know yet how literally that thought would come true. We drove for nearly 2 hours before the vehicle slowed at a checkpoint I had not expected to find in the middle of open farmland, a checkpoint with security measures far beyond anything I had seen even at classified diplomatic facilities. Guards checked our credentials with quiet efficiency, scanning us both, their faces giving away nothing. Beyond the checkpoint, the road continued toward what looked, from a distance, like an ordinary cluster of agricultural buildings. It was not agricultural buildings. As we drew closer, I began to make out the true scale of what lay beneath the unassuming surface structures, hints of vast underground construction, ventilation towers disguised as grain silos, an entire hidden world humming quietly beneath a landscape designed to look like nothing at all. "Welcome," Owen said, as the vehicle finally came to a stop, "to the place where humanity has been quietly growing up, while the rest of the galaxy assumed we were still children." I stepped out of the vehicle into cool night air, staring at the ordinary-looking buildings ahead of us, unable to shake the feeling that I was standing at the very edge of something enormous, something that had been building in silence for my entire adult life, waiting only for the right moment to finally wake. I did not know it yet, but that moment was closer than any of us realized. The elevator down took almost 3 full minutes, and I spent every second of it trying to guess what I was about to see. Owen said nothing during the descent, watching the numbers fall on the display above the doors, his expression calm in a way that made me even more nervous than if he had looked worried. When the doors finally opened, I understood, in the space of a single breath, why so many brilliant people had vanished quietly from my life over the past several years. The chamber before us was enormous, far larger than the buildings above ground had suggested was possible. It stretched out under a domed ceiling that must have been carved from solid rock, its curved surface embedded with soft lighting that mimicked a clear night sky. Below that false sky, hundreds of workstations spread out in careful rows, staffed by scientists and engineers, moving with the quiet, practiced urgency of people who had done this work so many times that it had become instinct. At the center of it all stood a structure unlike anything I had ever seen. It rose from the chamber floor in a slow spiral. Rings of pale silver material stacked one above another, each ring slightly rotated from the one below it, so that the whole structure seemed to twist gently upward like something growing rather than something built. Threads of soft blue light traced patterns across its surface, patterns that shifted slowly, almost like breathing. "What is that?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, as though the chamber demanded a kind of reverence I had not expected to feel. "We call it the anchor," Owen said. "It's a small piece of something much larger, a working model built from fragments we recovered and finally learned to understand. The real structure, the one this anchor is connected to, is not here. It's scattered across dozens of systems, hidden inside ruins the Ascendancy stopped studying centuries ago because they believed there was nothing left to learn." I stared at the slow, twisting light of the anchor, trying to absorb the scale of what he was describing. "You're telling me this connects to something spread across dozens of star systems?" "I'm telling you, it connects to something spread across a significant portion of this arm of the galaxy," Owen said. "A network, built by a civilization so far in the past that even the Ascendancy considers them ancient history. A civilization capable of doing something no one currently alive has ever witnessed, moving stars." I laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, before I saw the seriousness in his face and realized he meant it exactly as he had said it. "Moving stars," I repeated. "You don't mean destroying them. You mean actually moving them." "Not the stars themselves, not exactly," said a new voice behind us, warm and a little breathless, as though its owner had hurried to catch us before we moved further into the chamber. I turned to see a woman approaching, tall, with dark curls pulled back loosely, and ink stains on her fingers that suggested she still preferred writing things down by hand. Repositioning the stable points around them, adjusting the gravitational lattice that holds star systems in relation to one another. It's a difference that matters enormously to the physics, and matters much less to the people who suddenly find their star charts useless. "Elena," Owen said, "this is Dr. Grace Linden. She has led the physics team on this project for the last 9 years. Grace extended a hand, and I shook it, still trying to process everything I was hearing. "You've been working on this for 9 years, I said, "and no one outside this facility knows." "A very small number of people outside this facility know," Grace corrected gently. "Enough to keep the project funded and protected, not enough to risk it becoming public before it was ready. Believe me, keeping a secret this size quiet has been its own kind of engineering challenge." She smiled, though there was exhaustion behind it, the kind that comes from years of careful, relentless work. "Come, let me show you what 9 years actually looks like, since you clearly have questions that a hallway conversation won't answer." She led us through the chamber, past workstations where researchers barely looked up from displays covered in equations and diagrams I did not begin to understand. As we walked, she began to explain, in careful, patient language, the story behind everything I was seeing. Long before humanity had ever left its own solar system, unmanned probes exploring the edges of nearby star systems had detected structures that defied easy explanation. They were not planets. They were not natural formations. They were vast, artificial constructions embedded deep within stellar systems, structures that seemed to serve no immediate purpose, structures that gave off no detectable energy, structures that every existing spacefaring civilization, including the Ascendancy, had long ago dismissed as inert ruins from a civilization too old and too gone to matter. "The Ascendancy studied fragments of this network centuries ago," Grace said, as we walked past a section of the chamber where a massive, semi-transparent model of a star system rotated slowly above a central platform, threads of light connecting distant points like a web of glowing string. They concluded the structures were dead, that whatever ancient builders had made them were long extinct, and whatever function the network once served had stopped working millennia ago. They moved on. They stopped studying it. "But it wasn't dead," I said, echoing what Owen had told me at the cafe. "It was never dead," Grace said. "It was sleeping, in the truest sense of the word, dormant. waiting for a very specific kind of signal to wake it, a signal so complex, so precisely calibrated, that no civilization since its creation had managed to produce it correctly. She stopped walking and turned to face me directly. Until us. I stared at her, feeling the full weight of what she was telling me settle over me slowly, like snow accumulating on a roof, until the structure beneath finally has to acknowledge the load. How did we manage what an empire 80,000 years old could not? Grace's expression turned thoughtful, almost gentle. That's the question I ask myself some days too, she admitted. I think part of the answer is simply this. The ascendancy is old, and old civilizations, even brilliant ones, develop habits. They stop questioning assumptions that were settled long before they were born. They inherited the belief that this network was dead from their own ancestors, and they never seriously questioned it, because questioning it was not necessary for their comfort or their power. And we questioned it, I said. We had no choice but to question everything, Grace said. We're new. We don't have the luxury of inherited certainty. Every assumption we hold, we built ourselves, recently, under pressure, with people who still remembered what it felt like not to know the answer. She smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes fully. It turns out that not knowing things, and being desperate enough to keep asking why, is its own kind of advantage. One an old empire forgets it ever needed. We continued through the chamber, and Grace introduced me to members of her team, each one carrying a small piece of the enormous puzzle that had, together, made this moment possible. A quiet man named Daniel Osborne who had spent a decade studying the mathematics of the network's signal patterns before finally cracking the sequence that let them begin communicating with it. A woman named Clara Ashford who had led the engineering effort to build the anchor at the chamber's center, translating theoretical breakthroughs into something that could actually be built and tested. A younger researcher named Adrian Cole, barely older than I was, who had discovered, almost by accident, that fragments of the network scattered across different systems were not separate structures at all, but pieces of a single, unimaginably large machine. How many systems does the full network reach? I asked, as Grace led us toward a raised platform overlooking the anchor at the chamber's heart. More than we originally believed, Adrian answered before Grace could, his voice carrying the barely restrained excitement of someone still amazed by his own discovery. When we first started mapping the fragments, we thought we were looking at perhaps a dozen isolated sites. It took years to realize they were connected, threaded together across a huge stretch of this galactic arm, dormant nodes in a single vast lattice. He gestured toward the rotating model of the star system nearby. The Ascendancy's entire empire sits inside the reach of this network, though they've never understood that. They built their civilization on top of something they never fully mapped, because they assumed, wrongly, that it no longer mattered. I found myself staring at the slow, patient light moving across the surface of the anchor, trying to comprehend the scale of what these people had spent their lives uncovering. It was not simply a discovery. It was a complete reordering of everything I had believed about our place in the galaxy, delivered so quietly that even I, a diplomat who had traveled deep into Ascendancy territory, had known nothing about it until this very night. Why show me this now? I asked, turning to Owen. Why not before the mission? Why let me stand in that hall not knowing any of this, while they laughed at us? Owen's expression softened, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something almost apologetic in his face. Because the mission needed to be genuine, he said. If you had known what was coming, some part of you might have carried it into that room, a kind of quiet confidence that would have shown on your face, in your posture, in the way you carried yourself. We needed the Ascendancy to see exactly what they expected to see. A young species, humble, hopeful, easy to dismiss. We needed their reaction to be honest, unguarded, so that what comes next carries its full weight. You used me, I said, though there was less anger in the words than I expected to feel. We asked you to be honest, Owen corrected gently, which you were. And now, because of that honesty, no one will ever be able to say we provoked this. No one will be able to say we wanted conflict. We offered friendship, sincerely, and we were mocked for it. What happens next is simply the truth of what we have built, arriving in its own time. Grace led us further along the platform, until we stood almost directly beneath the anchor's slow, twisting spiral, close enough now that I could feel a faint hum in the air, a vibration just at the edge of hearing, like the low resonance of a bell struck long ago that had never quite finished ringing. "We're not doing this to hurt anyone," Grace said quietly, following my gaze upward. "This isn't a weapon aimed at a target. It's closer to turning on a light in a room that has been dark for a very long time. The network doesn't destroy stars. It doesn't destroy planets. It repositions the underlying structure that holds star systems in relation to each other, the deep architecture beneath what everyone assumes is simply fixed and permanent. And when you do that," I said slowly, working through the implications, "every star chart in ascendancy space becomes wrong. Every star chart in a significant portion of the galaxy becomes wrong," Adrian corrected, unable to keep a note of awe out of his voice even now. "Navigation systems, territorial boundaries drawn along stellar alignments, ancient trade routes that have existed for tens of thousands of years, sacred markers built around specific stellar patterns that certain cultures consider foundational to their entire history and identity." He shook his head slowly. "It will not simply inconvenience them. It will force every civilization within reach of the network to acknowledge, all at once, that the universe they believed was fixed and unchanging is not fixed at all, and that the species who did it was the same one they laughed out of a formal hall less than a month ago." I stood there, looking up at the slow, patient light of the anchor, trying to imagine the moment it would finally wake in full, trying to imagine what it would feel like for an empire 80,000 years old to watch its entire understanding of the sky rearrange itself in a single night. "When does this happen?" I asked. Owen and Grace exchanged a glance, the kind shared by people who have been waiting a long time for a particular question and are relieved to finally be able to answer it honestly. "Soon," Owen said. "The final calibrations were completed, the same week we stood in that hall being told to grow up." A faint, tired smile crossed his face. It seemed only fair to let them have their laughter first. They earned that much at least. The last laugh, before everything changed. "How long have you known the timeline?" I asked him directly. "Long enough to know that the invitation we delivered was never really the beginning of anything," he said. "It was the closing line of one chapter, spoken out of courtesy, before the next one began, without needing their permission at all." I turned back to look at the anchor, its light tracing slow, deliberate patterns across silver rings that had waited, patiently, for the right moment to finally wake something far larger than themselves. I thought about the black stone hall, the laughter rolling through it like a wave, the casual, absolute certainty in Lord Vesseren's voice as he told us to grow up and come back in 1,000 years. I thought about how very soon that certainty was about to meet something it had never once considered possible. "Show me everything," I said. "If this is truly happening, I want to understand what we've built, before the rest of the galaxy has to." Grace smiled, the tired warmth in her expression finally giving way to something that looked almost like relief, as though she had been waiting years for someone from outside this hidden chamber to finally be ready to see the whole picture. "Then let's start at the beginning," she said, "and let us deeper into the heart of the facility, past control rooms and calculation chambers, and quiet hallways lined with the accumulated work of nearly a decade, toward the final activation sequence that would, within days, change the shape of the sky itself." I did not sleep again that night, or for several nights after. There was too much to learn, too much to understand, and beneath all of it, a growing, quiet certainty that I was standing at the very edge of history, watching it prepare to turn. The final days before activation passed in a blur of learning, and I found myself absorbing more in a week than I had in years of diplomatic training. Grace and her team walked me through the history of the network, the decades of failed signals and near misses, the moment Daniel Osborne had finally cracked the mathematics of its dormant language, the long nights spent testing smaller activations on isolated fragments, far from any inhabited system, just to be certain the process was safe before it was ever attempted at scale. I learned that the network's builders, whoever they had been, were gone so completely that not even the smallest trace of their language, their appearance, or their culture remained. Only the silent, patient machine they had left behind, humming quietly beneath the galaxy, for longer than any current civilization had existed. I learned that the anchor at the center of the facility was only a single access point, one of many scattered across human-controlled space, each one connected to the same vast lattice buried within star systems the Ascendancy had long since stopped paying attention to. On the final night, I stood in the control chamber with Owen, Grace, Daniel, Clara, and Adrian, along with dozens of others who had given years of their lives to this moment, watching final checks scroll across enormous displays that lined the chamber walls. The anchor's slow, twisting light had grown brighter over the preceding days, its hum deepening into something I could feel through the floor beneath my feet. "Are you afraid?" I asked Grace quietly, as the countdown on the main display ticked toward its final hour. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "A little," she admitted. "Not of the science. The science is sound. We've tested every part of this 100 times over. I think what I'm afraid of is simpler than that. I'm afraid of what it means to be the generation that changes something this old, this fundamental. Once we do this, there's no undoing it. The galaxy on the other side of tonight will not be the same galaxy that existed this morning." I understood exactly what she meant. I felt it too, a mixture of awe and quiet dread, the particular feeling of standing at the edge of a threshold you know you are about to cross, whether you are ready or not. The final countdown reached its last minute, and the chamber fell into a hush so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. Daniel Osborne's hands moved steadily across his console, inputting the final sequence, the culmination of everything his team had worked toward for so many silent years. Clara watched her engineering displays with fierce concentration, monitoring every readout for the smallest sign of instability. Adrian stood beside the rotating model of the star system, his eyes fixed on the anchor itself, as though he could not bear to look away from the moment his discovery finally proved itself true. "Activation in 10 seconds, a calm voice announced over the chamber's speakers. I found myself reaching for Owen's arm without quite deciding to, and he did not pull away, standing steady beside me as the countdown reached its final numbers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The anchor's light did not explode outward, the way I had half expected it to. It simply changed, all at once, from its slow, patient blue to a bright, steady white, and the hum that had filled the chamber for days deepened into something that was not quite sound at all, something I felt more in my chest than in my ears. The rings of the anchor began to rotate faster, each one shifting against the others in patterns too complex to follow, and for a long, breathless moment, nothing else seemed to happen at all. Then the main display, the one showing the rotating model of the star system, flickered, and the pattern of light connecting its distant points began, slowly, to shift. "It's working," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might disturb whatever delicate process was unfolding. "The signal's propagating. Nodes across the network are responding, one after another, exactly the way the models predicted." I watched the display in silence, along with everyone else in that chamber, as threads of light on the model began to redraw themselves, star systems shifting their relative positions in slow, deliberate patterns, the deep architecture beneath the visible universe finally waking after untold thousands of years of dormant sleep. "How far will it reach?" I asked quietly. "Far," Grace said, her eyes fixed on the display, her voice carrying a mixture of triumph and something almost reverent. "Further than we fully predicted, if the early readings are accurate. This isn't isolated to a handful of systems. It's cascading, node to node, exactly the way the ancient architecture was designed to do." Somewhere out among those distant, shifting points of light, I knew, though I could not see it directly, the Ascendancy's home system was included, along with the black stone hall where I had stood less than a month earlier, listening to Lord Vesseron's laughter roll through a room built to make visitors feel small. I tried to imagine what it must be like there, right now, in this exact moment. I tried to imagine astronomers looking up at instruments that had, until tonight, been reliable for longer than their civilization's recorded history, watching those instruments suddenly report positions that made no sense, watching ancient certainties dissolve in real time. The activation continued for nearly 6 hours, the anchor's light steady and unwavering throughout, the chamber around it filled with the quiet, focused energy of people watching the culmination of their life's work finally unfold, exactly as they had hoped. I stayed through all of it, unwilling to look away, aware that I was witnessing something that would be studied and remembered for as long as anyone remembered anything at all. Near the end of the process, Grace turned to me, her face lit by the anchor's white glow, exhaustion and wonder mingling in her expression in equal measure. "You asked me once how we managed something the Ascendancy could not," she said. "I think I finally have a better answer for you." "What is it?" I asked. "They stopped believing the sky could change," she said. "We never did." She looked back toward the anchor, its light steady and patient, exactly as it had been designed to be by builders who had vanished long before either of our species existed. That's the whole difference in the end. Not intelligence, not resources, just the willingness to keep questioning something everyone else had already decided was settled. I thought about the hall again. The ancient star charts carved into black stone walls, charts that had not changed in thousands of years, charts I now understood must have been humming faintly that whole time, waiting, the same way the anchor before me had waited, for a signal no one in that hall had ever imagined we could produce. Reports began arriving, before the activation had even fully completed, filtered through channels that reached the facility, from sources scattered across human-controlled space and beyond. Ships in transit near the edge of Ascendancy territory reported sudden, unexplained shifts in navigational readings. Automated relay stations recorded brief bursts of confused signal traffic from systems well within Ascendancy borders, the kind of chaotic communication that follows when something fundamental and unexpected disrupts normal operations. "They're noticing," Clara said, watching the incoming reports scroll across her console. "Faster than I expected, honestly. Their systems are more sensitive to this kind of disruption than we anticipated." "Good," Owen said quietly, and there was no triumph in his voice, only a kind of steady resolve. They should notice. This was never meant to happen quietly. I watched the reports continue to accumulate over the following hours, fragments of confusion and alarm rippling outward across a portion of the galaxy that had, until tonight, considered its understanding of the universe permanent and unshakable. I thought about the moment Lord Vesserin had turned his back on us in that hall, the most complete dismissal his culture had to offer, and I found myself wondering what expression might be on his face now, as the stars themselves began quietly, irrevocably, to prove him wrong. By the time the activation sequence finally completed, the chamber around me was filled with a strange, exhausted stillness, the particular quiet that follows an enormous effort, finally reaching its conclusion. Grace sank into a chair near her console, pressing her palms against her eyes for a long moment, before looking back up at the anchor, its light settling into a steady, gentle blue once more, though something in its glow now felt different, awake in a way it had not been before. "It's done," Daniel said softly, reading the final confirmation from his displays. "Full propagation achieved. Every mapped node in the network responded and stabilized within predicted parameters." A quiet ripple of relief and disbelief moved through the chamber. Scientists and engineers who had spent years, in some cases most of their careers, working toward this single moment, finally allowing themselves to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. There was no loud celebration, no cheering, just a kind of hushed, profound satisfaction, the quiet joy of people who understood, better than anyone, exactly how much had gone into this night. I stood beside Owen, watching the main display continue to update with fragments of information pouring in from across human-controlled space and beyond, each report confirming the same enormous truth. The sky, for a significant portion of the galaxy, had changed, permanently and irreversibly, in the span of a single night. "What happens now?" I asked him quietly. Owen was silent for a moment, watching the display with an expression I found difficult to read, somewhere between satisfaction and something more solemn. "Now," he said finally, "we send a message. Not an invitation this time. Simply a notice, calm and clear, so there is no confusion about what has happened, or why." "What will it say?" He turned to look at me, and for the first time since that night in the cafe, I saw something almost gentle in his expression, a kind of quiet compassion beneath the resolve. "It will say that the invitation remains open," he said. "Because it does, Elena. It always did. We never wanted conflict with the Ascendancy. We simply refused to wait 1,000 years to be taken seriously." I looked back toward the anchor, its light steady and patient once more, and beyond it, in my mind's eye, toward a galaxy that had, in the span of a single night, been quietly and irrevocably reminded that even the oldest certainties could still be rewritten by those willing to keep asking why. I did not know, Standing there in that chamber, exhausted and awestruck in equal measure, exactly what would come next. But I understood, with a clarity I had not felt since standing in that black stone hall listening to laughter roll over me like a wave, that whatever came next would arrive on humanity's terms, calm and unhurried, the way patient people finally answer questions that impatient people never thought to ask. Somewhere far above the facility, beyond the false night sky painted across the chamber's high ceiling, the real sky had already begun quietly rearranging itself, and I found myself wondering how long it would take before the rest of the galaxy noticed exactly what that meant. It would not take long at all. 3 weeks passed before the Ascendancy responded, and I spent every one of those weeks watching the galaxy learn to breathe differently. The reports that filtered into our facility during that time painted a picture I found difficult to fully imagine, though I tried, every night, lying awake and picturing what it must have been like inside that black stone hall when the truth finally became impossible to ignore. Ancient navigation systems, unchanged for tens of thousands of years, suddenly returning readings that made no sense to anyone who had trusted them their whole lives. Trade routes that had connected Ascendancy worlds since before written history abruptly severed, their carefully calculated paths, now leading toward empty space, where stars no longer sat in their expected places. Sacred alignments, structures and ceremonies, built around specific stellar patterns, considered foundational to entire cultures within the Empire, suddenly meaningless. Their significance unmoored overnight. Owen told me, during one of our long conversations in the facility's quiet corridors, that the disruption had not been violent in any physical sense. No ships were harmed. No worlds were damaged. The network had done exactly what its ancient builders designed it to do, repositioning the deep architecture of stellar relationships with a precision that left everything physically intact, while leaving nothing psychologically undisturbed. "It's not destruction," Grace explained to me one evening as we watched updated reports scroll across her console. "It's revelation. We didn't break anything. We simply showed them that what they believed was permanent was never permanent at all. That kind of truth is harder to recover from than almost any physical damage could ever be." I thought about Lord Vesserin, standing in his hall, surrounded by nobles who had built their entire sense of order and permanence around a universe they believed they fully understood. I wondered what it felt like for a being who had lived for centuries, who had inherited certainty from ancestors going back tens of thousands of years, to suddenly discover that the sky itself could be rewritten by a species he had dismissed as children less than a month earlier. The message we sent, the one Owen had described to me on the night of the activation, was simple and carefully composed. I helped draft parts of it myself, working alongside a small team of linguists and diplomats who understood that every word would be scrutinized, translated, and remembered for a very long time. It did not gloat. It did not threaten. It stated, plainly, that humanity had completed a project many years in the making, that the changes to stellar architecture across a portion of the galaxy were the result of that project, and that the offer of friendship extended weeks earlier in the Ascendancy's own hall remained, as it always had, genuinely open. We did not expect a quick response. Ancient empires, Owen reminded me, move carefully, especially when frightened, and there was no version of this event that did not leave the Ascendancy shaken to its core. The response finally came on a quiet morning, delivered not through the casual, dismissive channels that had handled our first invitation, but through the highest formal diplomatic protocols the Ascendancy possessed. Protocols reserved, I was told, for civilizations they considered true equals. I read the message 3 times before I fully believed what I was seeing. It requested, respectfully, a formal audience between representatives of Earth and the full ruling council of the Threndari Ascendancy, at a location and time of our choosing. "They're asking us to set the terms," I said, staring at the message in disbelief. "They never do that. Not for anyone." "They've never had to consider anyone an equal before," Owen said quietly, reading over my shoulder. "This is what it looks like when they finally do." I was chosen, along with Owen, to lead the delegation for this second meeting, a decision that filled me with a strange mixture of pride and lingering unease. I remembered too clearly what it had felt like to stand in that hall the first time, folder in hand, listening to laughter that seemed to have no end. I was not eager to return to that same room, even under entirely different circumstances. We chose neutral ground for the meeting, a station built jointly by several smaller spacefaring civilizations along the border of ascendancy space, a place designed specifically for diplomacy between powers who did not wish to grant the appearance of advantage to either side. I remember standing in the station's observation deck the night before the meeting, looking out at a star field that included, faintly in the distance, systems whose positions had shifted only weeks earlier, and feeling the strange, quiet weight of standing at the edge of a history that was still being written in real time. "Are you nervous?" Owen asked, joining me at the window. "A little," I admitted. Last time I stood across from them, I had nothing to hold on to except patience. This time, I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Owen was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he gave everything. "I think," he said finally, "you're allowed to feel proud. Not proud in the way they were, when they laughed at us. Proud the way you feel, after finishing something difficult, honestly, without needing anyone else to validate it for you." I turned to look at him. "Do you think they'll apologize?" "I don't think that matters as much as you'd expect," he said. "What matters is whether they're finally ready to listen. An apology without understanding is just noise. Understanding, even without an apology, is worth infinitely more." The following morning, we entered the station's central meeting chamber, a room far smaller and far less ornate than the black stone hall I remembered, designed specifically to place both sides on equal physical footing, without the elevated platforms or grand architecture that had made the Ascendancy's own hall feel like a performance of power, rather than a genuine exchange. Lord Vesserin was there, along with a full delegation of Ascendancy counselors, including the bronze-skinned woman who had mocked our invitation as a request for charity. Vesserin's expression, when I first saw it, was unreadable, in a way I found more unsettling than the mockery had been. A careful neutrality that suggested an enormous effort at composure. "Attaché Whitfield," he said, as we took our seats across from the Ascendancy delegation. "Negotiator Pratt, I confess, I did not expect to see either of you again so soon. Nor did we expect to be sending you a second message so quickly," Owen replied evenly. "Though I imagine, for very different reasons than you might guess." Vesserin studied us both for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his ancient eyes, something that looked almost like the same curiosity I thought I had glimpsed during our first meeting, though it carried a very different weight now. "The disruption to our stellar architecture," he said finally, choosing his words with obvious care, "has caused significant difficulty across our territories. Navigation, trade, matters of cultural and religious significance that I will not attempt to explain to you in full, as I doubt your species has direct experience with structures of that particular kind. We understand it caused significant disruption," Owen said, his voice calm, but not without genuine acknowledgement. "That was never our intention, and I want to be clear about that from the outset. We did not undertake this project to harm the Ascendancy, or to force you into anything. We undertook it because it was ours to complete, a project that predates the invitation we delivered to your hall by many years. You are telling me," Vesserin said slowly, "that this was already underway before you ever stood before our court." "Long before," I said, speaking for the first time since we had entered the chamber. "The invitation you laughed at was never really about hoping you would say yes that day. It was a courtesy, offered honestly, before we finished something we had already decided to complete regardless of your answer." A ripple of quiet unease moved through the Ascendancy delegation, and I watched several counselors exchange glances I could not fully interpret. The bronze-skinned counselor who had spoken so sharply during our first visit remained silent now, her earlier confidence nowhere in evidence. "Then explain it to me," Vesserin said, and there was something almost raw in the request, a genuine desire to understand that I had not expected from him. "Explain how a species, 43 years into spacefaring existence, accomplished something our civilization, 80,000 years old, considered not merely difficult, but impossible." We studied those ruins. We concluded they were dead. Grace, who had traveled with our delegation specifically for this moment, leaned forward slightly. "You concluded they were dead because your ancestors concluded it first," she said, her voice gentle but direct. "And once that conclusion became settled fact within your culture, no one felt the need to question it again. That is not a failure of intelligence, my lord. It is simply what happens to certainty when it goes unquestioned for long enough. And your species questioned it," Vesserin said. We had to, Grace said. We don't have 80,000 years of inherited answers to lean on. Everything we know, we had to discover recently, under pressure, often by people willing to be wrong many times before finally being right once. That process doesn't happen when you already believe you have all the answers you need. Vesserin was silent for a long moment, and the chamber around us held that silence carefully, as though everyone present understood that something important was shifting in the space between his words and his thoughts. When we mocked your invitation, he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, we believed we were correcting a young species that had overestimated its own importance. I still believe, in some sense, that young civilizations benefit from humility. He paused, and something almost pained crossed his ancient features. But I did not understand, until 3 weeks ago, that humility and capability are not the same measure. You were humble in that hall, and mocked for it, while quietly capable of something my entire empire had failed to achieve in 80,000 years of existence. We didn't come here for an apology, Owen said gently. We came because the invitation we offered was always sincere, and it remains sincere now. We are not interested in humiliating an empire that has existed longer than our entire recorded history. We are interested in the same thing we asked for, the first time, a genuine, respectful relationship between our peoples, built on equal footing. Vesserin looked at each of us in turn, and I watched, with something between disbelief and quiet satisfaction, as the same being who had once turned his back on us in the most complete dismissal his culture possessed, now leaned forward instead, engaging with an openness that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Equal footing, he repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the phrase. I confess, my Lord Pratt, I am not certain my council fully understands what that would require of us. We are not accustomed to standing beside a species we do not already understand completely. None of us understand each other completely yet, I said. That's rather the point of an invitation, my lord. It isn't an agreement already settled. It's simply an offer to begin finding out. Something in Vesserin's expression shifted then, something I could only describe as the beginning of genuine respect, hard-won, and carefully considered, rather than freely given. Your species has a gift for turning humiliation into leverage without ever raising your voice, he said, and for the first time, there was no mockery in his tone at all, only something that sounded almost like admiration. I am beginning to understand why you did not seem troubled, 3 weeks ago, by our laughter. We were troubled, I admitted honestly. I stood in your hall, and felt every bit of that laughter. But we chose not to let it become anger, because anger would have proven the very thing you assumed about us. That we were young, reactive, easily provoked. I met his eyes steadily. We wanted you to see something different instead. Patience, and the willingness to let our actions speak, in their own time, more clearly than our words ever could. The negotiations that followed lasted the better part of 3 days, careful and detailed, covering matters of trade, of shared research into the ancient network now partially awake beneath both our territories, of protocols for future contact that would prevent the kind of misunderstanding that had defined our first meeting. There was no more laughter in that chamber, but there was, gradually, something far more valuable beginning to take root, a cautious, hard-earned respect between two civilizations who had started their relationship as poorly as two peoples possibly could. On the final evening of the negotiations, as our delegations prepared to part ways, Vesserin approached me privately, away from the formal proceedings, his manner quieter and more personal than anything I had seen from him before. Atash Whitfield, he said, I owe you a debt of understanding, if not precisely an apology. When I told your delegation to grow up and return in 1,000 years, I believed I was offering practical wisdom to a species that could not possibly be ready for what it was asking. I did not consider that perhaps you were not asking permission to grow up at all. Perhaps you had already done so, quietly, while the rest of us assumed we already knew the shape of your future. We didn't need your permission, my lord, I said, though I said it gently, without any trace of the anger I might once have felt. We only ever wanted your friendship. Those are very different things, and I think that's the part your court misunderstood most that day. Vesserin nodded slowly, something thoughtful and a little humbled, settling over his ancient features. The galaxy your species has revealed to us, he said, is larger and stranger than we believed possible, even after 80,000 years of studying it. I find, unexpectedly, that I am curious to see what else it might still be hiding, now that we have finally been reminded not to assume we already know everything worth knowing. I smiled at that, the first genuine smile I had allowed myself in his presence since the day I first walked into his hall carrying a folder no one wanted to read. "That's a good place to begin, my lord," I said. "Curiosity, rather than certainty. I think you'll find it suits the next chapter of your empire rather well." We returned home not long after, and in the months that followed, I watched the relationship between Earth and the Threndari Ascendancy grow slowly into something neither humiliating nor triumphant, but genuinely collaborative, built on the uneasy, hard-won respect that comes only after two peoples have truly tested each other and found something worth continuing. I think about that first hall often, the laughter rolling through it like a wave, the absolute certainty in Vesserin's voice as he dismissed us without a second thought. I think about how close we came, in that moment, to believing that certainty ourselves, to walking away convinced that we truly were as small and unready as they insisted we were. We were not small. We were simply quiet, for a little while, building something enormous in the silence, before anyone else thought to look for it. The stars above every world touched by that ancient network still carry the mark of what we did that night, rearranged forever into patterns no ancient chart could have predicted, and I like to think that somewhere in that new arrangement of light, there is a small, permanent reminder that even the oldest certainties in the galaxy are never quite as fixed as they appear, so long as someone, somewhere, is still willing to ask why. I was there when the laughter finally stopped, and I was there again when it turned, slowly and honestly, into something far more valuable: respect, earned rather than given, between two peoples who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that greatness is never measured by how long a civilization has existed, but by how bravely it is willing to keep growing, long after everyone else assumes it has already stopped.